The first tank fired. A wall of flame ripped through the trench, men thrown like rag dolls, radios bursting with static. Another shell landed, tearing steel and bone alike. The Kharkov plains shook under iron thunder. "Pull back! We can't hold!" Someone screamed. Then came the roar, low, savage. The A-10 burst from the clouds, banking hard, cannons already spitting fire. The GAU-8 shredded armor like paper. Turrets flew, fuel tanks blossomed in fireballs. Soldiers froze mid-step, eyes wide, the impossible unfolding before them. The unstoppable advance froze mid-charge. Steel met thunder and broke. Even the tank columns stalled in chaos. But who was she, the lone pilot rewriting the law of war? This is Veteran Biker. Comment 1 if you're new, 2 if you've been with us, 3 if you ride with us every week. Like, subscribe, and stay to the end. The battlefield was already a graveyard before she arrived. Across the Kharkov plains, black smoke spiraled upward, curling into the orange haze of late afternoon. The ground was split with fresh craters, gouges carved by the relentless pounding of tank fire. Infantrymen crawled through mud that moments ago had been solid soil, their rifles slipping from trembling hands. Some pressed themselves flat into shattered trenches, while others staggered, backward clutching torn radio sets that spat static and half-formed cries. From the ridgeline, the armored column pressed forward without pause. Dozens of steel giants rumbled as one, their engines drowning every human sound beneath a constant grinding roar. Tracks churned dirt into choking dust, while cannon blasts marked each second. With a concussion that rattled bone and turned the air itself into a weapon. To the men on the ground, it felt less like an army approaching than an avalanche of iron bearing down, unstoppable and merciless. Within the chaos, a lieutenant slammed his headset against his helmet. "They're cutting through everything! We have no way to stop them!" His voice broke between fury and despair. Around him, the command team inside the dugout exchanged helpless glances. Maps scattering off the table as another impact rocked the bunker. Someone shouted for retreat. Another barked that holding the line was the only choice. But the truth was painted across their pale faces. Nothing on the ground could blunt that armored spearhead. The column was minutes away from crushing what was left of the defense. Above the storm of artillery, a different sound carved its way through. At first it was distant, a faint growl against the thunder of cannons. Then it swelled, rolling like an approaching cyclone, deeper and more menacing than anything on the ground. Men looked up instinctively, shielding their eyes against the haze. The sound didn't just arrive, it announced itself, promising violence, and then she came. Aria Kovalenko dropped her A-10 through a ragged slit in the clouds, the sun flashing off the grey armor of her warplane. The blunt-nosed beast banked sharply, wide wings bristling with ordnance. Smoke trailed from its wingtips as it carved the sky into submission, engines howling low and guttural. To soldiers who had known only the grinding march of tanks, the sight of that machine tearing downward was something alien, like a predator entering a battlefield of prey. Inside the cockpit, Aria's jaw was tight, her breathing steady against the rise of her chest harness. Her visor reflected the burning horizon, HUD symbols dancing across glass. She had been told too many times that her aircraft was outdated, that the future belonged to sleek jets and satellites. Yet here, against rows of armor that threatened to erase an entire flank, she knew nothing in the arsenal could strike fear the way her Warthog could. Target acquired. Her voice muttered inside the helmet. Calm, almost detached. The GAU-8 beneath her belly opened with a thunderous growl. The cannon didn't speak. It roared, a mechanical snarl that tore the silence apart. Streams of depleted uranium rounds plunged downward, stitching a line of destruction straight into the lead vehicles. Metal split open as though it had been paper. One turret vaulted skyward, flipping before crashing down in flames. Another tank folded inward, its armor peeling back like shredded bark. Shock rippled through the plane. Infantrymen, who had been moments from fleeing, stopped in their tracks, jaws slack. The armored column itself hesitated. The advance faltered, tracks screeching as commanders inside shouted in disbelief. Arya banked left, vapor trails spiraling off her wingtips, the wind buffeting the cockpit. She rolled level, scanning for the densest part of the formation. Her breath fogged faintly against the mask as she prepared another run. Below, the surviving tanks scrambled to angle their turrets upward, barrels pivoting clumsily toward the predator that circled above them. Flashes of tracer fire clawed skyward, stitching fiery lines toward her. She dipped lower, hugging the contour of the hills, weaving between bursts of shrapnel. Her fingers adjusted the throttle delicately, as if taming a living creature rather than flying a machine. "Come on, old girl," she whispered, voice almost tender. "Let's show them you still have teeth." The battlefield obeyed her defiance. She pulled up sharply, the nose rising before cutting down into another dive. This time her payload was heavier, cluster munitions that she loosed with surgical precision. The canisters split open in midair, scattering their lethal contents across the flanks of the column. Explosions rippled outward in chain reactions, plumes of black smoke rising as vehicles erupted one after another. From the command dugout, the once skeptical officers leaned forward, eyes wide. Only minutes ago, their arguments had circled around retreat, resignation, and futility. Now they watched in silence as a single aircraft shredded what entire battalions had failed to slow. One colonel's lips parted in disbelief, his voice cracking with words. He hadn't intended to speak aloud. She's stopping them. Arya didn't hear their awe. All she heard was the rattling percussion of her cannon, the rhythmic kick that vibrated through the frame of her plane into her very bones. Each burst was an oath, each streak of fire a reminder that one pilot and one machine could still tilt the balance of a battlefield. The tanks regrouped, angling their armor, advancing in a staggered push to minimize the carnage. Some even pushed burning wrecks forward like makeshift shields. From above, Arya caught their desperate improvisation and narrowed her eyes. They were adapting, but adaptation meant hesitation. And hesitation was exactly what she needed. She climbed sharply, engines straining, then rolled inverted, hanging for a moment against gravity. From that vantage, the battlefield stretched beneath her like a chessboard in flames. She could see everything: the broken trenches, the huddled infantry, the snarling beasts of steel trying to regain momentum. For a fleeting instant, she allowed herself to believe this advance could be broken. Then the alarm screamed inside her cockpit. A shrill tone cut through her helmet, lights flashing red across her display. They had brought up mobile air defenses, missiles already seeking her heat signature. She cursed under her breath, slamming the stick forward. The A-10 dropped like a stone, G-forces crushing her into the seat. Trails of smoke whipped past as the missiles arced through the air, chasing the falling warplane. Arya twisted violently, rolling through a spiral that rattled every bolt in the fuselage. Shrapnel burst around her canopy, sparks dancing across the glass, but the aircraft endured. On the ground, soldiers tilted their heads upward, mouths dry as they watched missiles chasing the low-flying beast. Some prayed, others simply clenched their fists. For all the chaos, they knew that if she went down, the flood of armor would continue unopposed. But Arya did not fall. At the last possible moment, she pulled back hard, the warthog skimming just above the tree line. One missile overshot, another detonated prematurely in a cloud of fragments. She cut through the debris cloud, wings rattling but intact. Her breathing was heavy now, sweat slicking her brow beneath the helmet. Yet her eyes blazed steady, fixed on the horizon where the tanks still pressed forward, slower now but not stopped. She leveled out, letting the engines surge, preparing to climb again. The fight was only beginning, and she knew it. "Not today," she murmured. "Not on my watch." As she turned back for another pass, the Kharkov planes bore witness, one lone pilot against a wall of steel. And for the first time, the unstoppable advance looked uncertain. The battlefield held its breath. Smoke curled upward in twisting columns, the wrecks of burning tanks glowing like smoldering furnaces against the fading light. The roar of engines still filled the plain, but it no longer carried the same certainty. The column had slowed, each machine creeping forward with caution, wary of the predator circling above. Inside her cockpit, Arya adjusted her throttle with steady hands, her visor reflecting the broken landscape beneath. The shrill alarms had quieted, leaving only the hum of her engines and the rapid rhythm of her breath. She leaned forward, eyes narrowing as she studied the remaining formation. Their discipline hadn't collapsed yet. They were wounded but not broken, and that meant the threat remained. Below, soldiers huddled in shattered trenches lifted their heads to watch her shadow sweep overhead. To them, it wasn't just an aircraft. It was proof that they weren't abandoned. The despair that had flooded their lines minutes earlier now mingled with something harder to name: awe, disbelief, a spark of defiance. But hope was fragile, and it would take more than a single pass to hold the flood at bay. In the command dugout, the colonel, who had once dismissed her plane as obsolete, clutched his binoculars with white-knuckled hands. His jaw worked silently as he tracked her movements. The others around him murmured, their earlier arguments about retreat silenced by the evidence unfolding in the sky. Still, disbelief clung stubbornly. Could one pilot really halt an armored surge that had chewed through everything else? Arya banked sharply, pulling the nose of the warthog around. She wasn't blind to the danger. The ground below bristled with launchers, and every second she lingered painted her with invisible crosshairs. But hesitation wasn't a luxury she allowed herself. She whispered under her breath, not as a prayer but as a command to her machine, "Stay with me." The tanks tightened their formation, shifting into staggered blocks, using the wrecks of their fallen as cover. They were learning, adapting to her tactics. A curtain of tracer rounds stitched the air as they fired skyward, filling her path with deadly threads. Arya pressed lower, almost scraping the earth, weaving between the bursts. The smell of burning fuel seeped even through the sealed cockpit, acrid and sharp. She leveled out for her second strike, selecting her payload with a flick of her gloved hand. The aircraft responded instantly, the weight of its arsenal shifting across the wings. She aligned her reticle with the densest cluster of armor, her heartbeat slowing with trained precision. The release came like a snap. Ordnance dropped away, slicing through the air before detonating across the flanks of the column. Fire blossomed in jagged arcs, shock waves tearing through the ranks. Steel beasts convulsed under the impact, their tracks blown apart, hatches hurled open in bursts of flame. The plane erupted in thunder once more, but this time it was not the tanks dictating the rhythm. For a heartbeat, the offensive faltered again. Arya pulled upward, canopy rattling as she climbed back into the haze. The sky glowed orange, reflecting the inferno below. Her chest rose and fell beneath her harness, sweat running into the edges of her mask. She didn't celebrate, There was no time for that. Survival hinged on constant motion, constant pressure. On the ground, voices broke the silence. Infantrymen who had been crouched in despair now shouted over the roar of explosions, not with panic, but with renewed energy. Their commanders seized the moment, rallying the scattered units. Orders to regroup and hold positions cut through the static of radios. Arya hadn't just destroyed steel, she had lit fire back into men's hearts, but the enemy refused to collapse. Through the smoke, fresh armor emerged from the tree line, silhouettes massive and unyielding. These were no stragglers, they were reinforcements. The realization hit like a blow. The column wasn't merely a spearhead, it was part of something larger, and she had only struck the surface. Her warning lights blinked again, urgent and insistent. New threats locked onto her. More missile crews had rolled into position, using the distraction of the burning vehicles to set up. A deadly net was rising around her, unseen but certain. Arya's grip tightened on the controls. Down in the dugout, an officer barked for her to withdraw. The voice cracked with both authority and fear, yet no withdrawal came. Instead, the Warthog tilted once more, circling for another run. Arya's mind was clear, focused to a razor's edge. She had always been told her plane was too slow, too old, too easy a target for modern defenses. But she knew something the generals did not. Resilience wasn't measured in speed, but in resolve. Her machine was scarred, outdated, even mocked, but like her, it endured. She dropped altitude, hugging the contours of the plane. Missiles streaked skyward, contrails cutting through the haze. She rolled hard, throwing her aircraft sideways, forcing the weapons to overshoot. The cockpit shook violently, warning tones flaring, but the plane held together. The tanks below pressed forward again, emboldened by the reinforcements. Their cannons roared, shells slamming into the ridges, reducing what little cover the infantry had left. Flames licked across the horizon, turning dusk into a canvas of fire. Arya steadied herself. She knew this was only the beginning. The advance hadn't been stopped, only delayed, and she had to decide whether to risk everything on another dive or pull away and leave the men below to their fate. Her decision came without hesitation. She nosed down, engines howling as she drove her warplane back toward the heart of the storm. The Kharkov plains braced for another clash of steel and thunder. And somewhere below, soldiers who had nearly surrendered to despair looked skyward again, watching as one lone aircraft turned back into the fire. The ground convulsed beneath the armored tide as fresh waves of tracked monsters rolled from the tree line, the forest spitting out steel like an endless furnace. Flames from earlier strikes painted their armor in flickering orange, but still they came, relentless, their engines groaning like beasts roused from hibernation. Dust clouds ballooned behind them, swallowing the horizon, muffling the cries of infantry forced to give ground yet again. From her canopy, Arya Kovalenko caught the shift instantly. Reinforcements. It was not just a column. It was a steel phalanx meant to break the spine of every defense on the plain. Her lips pressed together, and she dragged the stick to bank hard into a turn, wings slicing through the smoky dusk. Warnings danced on her HUD. Not just the telltale glow of hostile armor, but something sharper, deadlier. The enemy had changed tactics. A lance of smoke shot upward from the undergrowth, then another. Arya's blood chilled even as her hands reacted with practiced precision. Mobile launchers. They had been lying in wait, concealed until she committed herself to another run. Now the net closed around her, hungry for her heat signature. The A-10 bucked under her grip as she rolled sharply, countermeasures spilling from her wings in glittering flares that streaked against the sky. The first missile curved hungrily toward the decoys, then exploded in a blossom of fire behind her tail. But the others held their lock, weaving through the haze, adjusting with terrifying accuracy. Down on the ground, soldiers who had been cheering her earlier passes now stared upward in horror. Trails of white smoke clawed toward the lone silhouette above, twisting like serpents in pursuit. Their breaths stuck in their throats, unable to shout, unable to look away. To them it seemed certain. No machine could survive that many hunters at once. Inside the cockpit, time fractured into fragments. Arya pulled her aircraft into a dive, the horizon flipping as the G-force crushed her into her seat. Her vision narrowed to a tunnel, edges flickering black, but her instincts guided her where thought could not. She skimmed so low that branches whipped against her fuselage, bark and leaves exploding in her wake as she threaded the warplane through the edge of the forest. One missile screamed past and detonated against the slope, showering her canopy in shards of earth. Another clipped the treetops, bursting prematurely in a sphere of fire that clawed uselessly at her armored skin. But two more still chased, weaving closer, relentless, her jaw clenched. She yanked the throttle, forcing the Warthog into a brutal climb. Alarms wailed inside the cockpit, lights flaring crimson, every instrument insisting she had seconds left. She ignored them all. The engines groaned as if they might tear themselves apart, but she held steady, lifting the nose higher and higher. The missiles followed, drawn by the furnace of her engines. At the last possible instant, she snapped the stick to the side and rolled, her craft tumbling through the sky like a tumbling coin. The missiles, unable to adjust in time, overshot, spiraling past her, before detonating in blinding blossoms that shook the heavens. Silence returned, brief, fragile. Arya sucked in air through her mask, her chest heaving, sweat stinging her eyes. The aircraft rattled but endured, its skin scarred by fragments, its engines still growling. The Warthog had survived yet again, just as stubborn and unyielding as the woman inside. In the command dugout, officers exhaled in unison, some collapsing back into their chairs, others clutching radios with trembling fingers. A major whispered, half in awe, half in disbelief, she outflew them. She actually outflew them. But Arya had no room for triumph. Below, the armored flood was regaining momentum. Their commanders had seen her evasive maneuvers and understood she was not invincible. If they overwhelmed her with fire from every angle, her odds of escape shrank. And yet, in that fleeting pause, another voice entered the fray. Not through her radio, through the enemy's hesitation. They were regrouping, and regrouping meant delay. Delay meant opportunity. Far below, tucked in a shallow trench on the ridgeline, a young operator hunched. Over a portable control panel, his knuckles white against the sticks. His UAV, a small reconnaissance drone, buzzed unseen high above the battlefield. He had been ordered to withdraw it, to conserve resources. Instead, defiance had rooted him in place. His screen glowed with the grainy outline of enemy armor. His thumb hovered, then pressed down. A beam of invisible light lanced from the drone, painting the side of a camouflaged launcher hidden between two ridges. On Arya's HUD, a small diamond bloomed, marking a weakness she couldn't have seen otherwise. She blinked once, then smiled faintly. Someone down there was still fighting with her. She swung the nose, lining up the shot. The JAW-8 snarled again, the cockpit trembling with its feral rhythm. Shells tore into the hidden launcher, detonating it in a bloom that flattened trees and flung debris into the sky. A gap opened in the enemy's shield, their formation staggered by the sudden breach. Infantrymen on the plain erupted into cheers, not merely at the explosion, but at the realization coordination still existed between air and ground. The line was not abandoned. It was alive, biting back. Arya looped upward once more, her aircraft cutting an arc across the smoke-stained horizon. She spotted more targets highlighted by the unseen Allies' laser, another launcher, then a cluster of tanks masked by the wreckage. Each strike widened the cracks in the enemy's advance until the plain was pockmarked with fire and ruined metal, but the enemy was not passive. Realizing their camouflage was compromised, they unleashed their fury. Anti-aircraft guns spat red tracers into the sky, a deadly lattice meant to slice her apart. The Warthog shuddered under the barrage, jolts rocking her seat as rounds stitched dangerously close. Still, she pressed forward, weaving through the inferno, squeezing every ounce of resilience from her machine. Below, the armored spearhead faltered. Momentum was slipping through their fingers, every advance blunted by the predator above. Tank crews barked frantic orders, some reversing in panic, others firing wildly into empty sky. Commanders who had been so sure of victory now wrestled with disbelief, the myth of unstoppable steel crumbling under the scream of a single warplane. Inside the cockpit, Arya's pulse steadied. The chaos below was no longer directionless. It had rhythm, a rhythm she was dictating. Every dive, every burst of fire rewrote the tempo of battle. She knew the fight was far from over, but in this moment she had shifted the current. And on battlefields, moments could decide legacies. The Warthog rose again through the haze, battered but alive, its engines trailing smoke like scars of defiance. Arya's eyes burned with focus as she scanned the horizon, seeking the next threat, the next challenge. On the ground, the young UAV operator wiped grime from his brow, whispering to no one in particular. She saw it. She used it. His lips curved into a grin, the first sign of hope he had dared to feel all day. Above them all, the lone aircraft wheeled through the sky, a hammer of thunder refusing to yield. The armored avalanche that had promised annihilation now stumbled, its certainty torn apart by courage and steel born in another age. The battle was not won, but for the first time the impossible seemed possible. And the world watched as one woman and her machine turned the Kharkov plains into a crucible where fate itself was being reforged. The sky over Kharkov was painted in streaks of smoke, a grim canvas of fire and ruin. The plain trembled under the sporadic thunder of tank fire, but the rhythm had changed. No longer a relentless surge, but broken beats punctuated by hesitation. Arya Kovalenko's strikes had carved fear into their armor, yet fear did not end battles. The column still pressed forward, staggered but alive, its commanders driving the machines with sheer will. Arya steadied her breathing, her gloved hand gripping the throttle as she pulled the A-10 into a climb. Her engines strained, dragging the beast upward until the battlefield shrank beneath her. Her visor reflected both the clouds above and the inferno below, her mind calculating angles as fast as her heart kept time. She needed more than another pass. She needed to shatter their cohesion in one decisive strike. The sun had dipped toward the horizon, glowing like molten copper. Arya angled her climb to position herself directly between its blinding glare and the tanks crawling across the plain. From below, her warplane would be a phantom, hidden in the brilliance, until it was too late. She exhaled slowly, allowing her muscles to relax, even as adrenaline coursed through her veins. Timing was everything. On the ground, infantrymen crouched among shattered fortifications, watching the steel tide reform. They saw turrets swinging, barrels spitting flame at phantom targets, desperate to pin her down. They didn't see her climb. Their eyes remained fixed on the armored monsters bearing down on them, unaware that above the glow of the setting sun, their salvation circled like a hawk. Inside the command bunker, arguments flared again. Some insisted the attack had bought them enough time to retreat and regroup farther back. Others swore that abandoning the field meant conceding the entire sector. The colonel, who had doubted her before, now stared silently through his binoculars, lips pressed into a line. His silence carried weight. He was waiting to see what she would do next. Arya's HUD lit up with new signals. More vehicles were pushing onto the plain from the far tree line. If she didn't break their momentum soon, the defenders would drown under sheer numbers. She set her jaw, nudging the stick forward. The nose of the warthog tipped downward, the horizon flipping as gravity pulled her into the dive. The sun blazed behind her, masking her silhouette. From below, there was only the glare, then the sudden scream of engines tearing through the air. Soldiers on both sides felt it before they saw it, the sense of something descending at impossible speed. Heads snapped upward, some shielding their eyes, others too slow to react. By the time they realized, she was already upon them. The GL-8 roared, its guttural thunder rolling across the plain like judgment. Streams of shells ripped into the heart of the armored formation, tearing gaps through the line. One vehicle erupted in a fountain of flame, another was split open, its ammunition cooking off in a series of violent bursts. The ground convulsed under the barrage, dirt and steel thrown skyward in a shower of destruction. Arya pulled through the dive, leveling just above the treetops, the canopy rattling as shrapnel peppered her wings. The machine shook, but held, responding to her every touch with the stubborn loyalty she had come to trust. She banked hard, circling wide for another run. Her breathing steadied, her focus absolute. The effect on the enemy was immediate. The column fractured, its once solid formation broken into scattered knots of steel. Crews shouted frantic orders, some tanks turning too sharply and colliding. With their own allies, others grinding to a halt in panic. The discipline that had seemed unbreakable minutes earlier now unraveled under the storm raining down from the sky. On the ridgeline, the infantry erupted. Men who had been on the brink of collapse now surged with renewed fury, voices rising over the carnage. They fired into the disoriented armor, targeting exposed crews scrambling out of wrecks. For the first time that day, the defenders were not just surviving, they were striking back. Arya's eyes flicked across her instruments. Her ammunition reserves were dropping, and every pass carried the risk of not returning. But the sight of the armored tide faltering ignited something deeper than calculation. She pressed the stick forward again, the engines answering her call with a feral growl. She angled toward the flank, where a cluster of tanks had attempted to regroup behind the hulks of their fallen. Their commanders thought the wreckage might shield them from her. She would prove them wrong. The cannon thundered again, tearing through the improvised barricades, shredding both steel and soil. Flames consumed the cluster in seconds. The wreckage they had trusted turned into a funeral pyre. Missiles streaked skyward once more, desperate to clip her wings. She rolled sharply, countermeasures spilling from her wingtips in dazzling bursts. Explosions rattled the air, shock waves buffeting her cockpit. The horizon spun and righted itself, her vision narrowing as G-forces threatened to drag her under. She bit down, forcing her body to hold, forcing her machine to endure. From the command post, the colonel lowered his binoculars, his hands trembling. "She's cutting them apart," he said quietly, almost reverently. The officers around him, once full of doubt, now stared at him with unspoken acknowledgement. The impossible was happening before their eyes. Arya leveled out once more, her engines screaming as she pushed the Warthog to its limits. The plain beneath her was a tapestry of fire and twisted metal, the armored phalanx reduced to fragments. Yet, in the smoke, she glimpsed movement. Survivors regrouping in desperation, clinging to the belief they could still push forward. Her eyes hardened. She had bought time, inflicted chaos, but chaos was not victory. Not yet. She climbed again, angling once more into the glare of the dying sun. The light wrapped around her, turning her machine into a silhouette of fire and shadow. Below, both friend and foe turned their eyes upward, knowing the storm was not finished. The Kharkov plains echoed with engines, with the crack of rifles, with the screams of men caught between steel and fire. But above it all was the howl of the Ten, descending once again, unrelenting. A hammer of thunder poised to strike until the advance broke completely. The second plunge began, more ruthless than the first, and as she bore down on the shattered column, one truth had already settled across the battlefield: steel could be shattered, discipline could be broken, and even the most unstoppable tide could falter under the wrath of a single will. The battlefield had become a furnace of broken engines and charred steel. Flames rolled across the plain, heat shimmering in waves that bent the horizon. Arya Kovalenko's Warthog had carved deep scars into the advance, leaving twisted hulks where once the column had thundered. Yet as the smoke thinned, silence did not bring relief. It carried a weight, a waiting. Every soldier on the ground felt it, a pause before something worse. The forest edge darkened. Branches shuddered as if moved by something colossal. Then the trees split apart, trunks toppling like matchsticks under invisible weight. Out of the shadows came a shape unlike the others. Taller, broader, its armored skin darker than night, gleaming with layered plates. It wasn't merely a tank. It was a fortress on tracks, the spearhead of a new generation, a machine designed to shrug off the very weapons Arya carried. Murmurs rippled through the trenches. Some soldiers stopped firing altogether, their rifles dipping as the realization hit. The wreckage of earlier vehicles had proven vulnerable, but this monster was built for an entirely different war. Its turret rotated with mechanical grace, sensors glinting red through the haze, and every step forward crushed the ground flat. Arya caught it immediately, her visor flashing with the fresh contact. Her stomach sank even as she tightened her grip on the controls. She had been warned about prototypes rumored in enemy ranks, machines that seemed invulnerable to conventional strikes. She had half dismissed them as exaggeration, tales meant to frighten. But now one rolled into the open, flanked by the last survivors of the shattered column, as if declaring, "You have not beaten us yet." The command post erupted into panicked shouts. Voices collided, arguing over whether to fall back, whether to abandon the field entirely. A general's tone cracked over the radio. "No aircraft can stop that thing. Pull her out before we lose her." But the words reached Arya only as noise. Her eyes were fixed on the behemoth grinding toward the center of the plain. She pushed the throttle forward, the engines roaring in answer. The A-10 swung around, circling higher as she measured the giant's movement. She knew she couldn't afford reckless bravado, yet hesitation would doom the men still clinging to their positions below. The monster fired. Its cannon boomed, a deeper sound than anything that had preceded it, a concussion that seemed to punch the very air. The round slammed into the ridge, obliterating stone and soil, flinging men into the dirt. Dust mushroomed outward, rolling over the trenches in choking clouds. Arya Dov The sun lit her wings in gold as she angled toward the target, the GAU-8 spitting fire once again. Shells hammered across the armored hide, sparking against its hull, carving shallow scars but failing to break through. She pulled up sharply, teeth clenched. For the first time, her weapon had not torn something apart, it had merely scratched. The revelation was immediate. If her primary gun could not penetrate, then every run carried risk without promise. Yet quitting was not an option. She forced herself calm, cycling through options. The monster turned its turret toward her, the barrel tracking with chilling precision. Tracer fire erupted from its escorts, streams of light clawing into the sky. Arya twisted, rolling through the barrage, her wings slicing between the bursts. Sweat stung her brow as she yanked the stick, climbing once again. Behind her, explosions rippled where the turret's shell detonated, the shockwaves slamming into her tail. In the dugout, silence replaced panic. Every eye was locked on the duel unfolding above the plain. Officers who had doubted her before now whispered as if speaking aloud might shatter the fragile balance. One muttered, "If she can't stop it, no one can." Arya steadied her breathing. She had one advantage left, maneuvering. The machine below was powerful, but it was rooted to the earth, lumbering forward in deliberate steps. She could outthink it, outmaneuver it, even if she couldn't outgun it. For now, she swung wide, using the smoke and setting sun as cover. From above, she studied the terrain, searching not for the tank's weaknesses, but for the battlefield's. Craters, wrecks, natural dips, anything she could exploit. Her mind raced. The giant moved again, its tracks grinding over the bodies of its fallen allies. It advanced steadily, ignoring small arms fire that pinged harmlessly against its shell. Every shot it fired gouged new craters into the landscape, each one closer to the defensive line. Arya dove again, but not for the kill. She strafed the flanking armor, tearing their formation apart, forcing the behemoth to crawl forward without its shield. Explosions flared along its sides as the last escorts fell to fire and shrapnel. Alone now, it stood larger, more terrible, but also more exposed. Her aircraft screamed skyward once more, engines straining. Her pulse matched the vibration in her seat, steady, controlled. She could feel the battlefield holding its breath again, waiting for her next move. The monster rolled forward, turret swiveling toward her climb, preparing to swat her from the sky. She whispered through clenched teeth, words only she could hear. "All right then, let's see who breaks first." The dive she prepared was different. Not a frontal strike, but an angled descent, meant to deceive. She tilted her nose down, lining up as if to aim directly for the turret. The behemoth responded, barrel tracking her descent with mechanical accuracy. At the last heartbeat, she yanked the stick sideways, rolling hard, the warthog slipping across the giant's flank. Shells screamed from her cannon, carving into the earth around its tracks, ripping away the ground it moved on. Dirt and fire erupted in walls beside it, shaking its balance. The tank lurched, one side dipping as its tread ground into the crater. It wasn't destroyed, but it staggered. The soldiers below roared in sudden realization. She hadn't needed to pierce it directly. She had made the earth itself betray it. For the first time, the monster shuddered, slowed, forced to fight against the terrain as much as against her. Arya pulled up, lungs burning, her body pressed into the seat by the brutal climb. She looked back over her shoulder at the battlefield below. The fortress tank was still moving, but no longer with the same certainty. Its advance had faltered, even if only for a moment, and in war, a moment was everything. The Colossus churned forward through the burning haze, each movement deliberate, inexorable, as if nothing in the world could turn it aside. Its silhouette loomed above the wrecks of lesser machines, smoke and flame coiling around its armored flanks like a crown of shadows. The earth trembled beneath its treads, and every boom of its cannon rattled the ribs of the men dug into the shattered ridges. Arya Kovalenko dragged her warplane higher into the copper light, the battered. A 10, climbing with the stubborn defiance that matched its pilot. She fought the shudder in the stick, the vibration that told her how much the airframe had endured already. Below, she glimpsed the monstrous tank tilting back to stability, dragging itself free of the crater she had used to stagger it. Its barrel tilted skyward, tracking her climb with chilling precision. Her breath slowed. Fear had no room inside her helmet, though it pulsed in her veins. What filled her chest was something heavier, sharper, resolve. She had faced the impossible before, but this was different. This machine was designed to make her obsolete, to erase everything her aircraft represented. It wasn't just a target, it was a challenge to her very existence. She whispered to herself, voice almost lost beneath the roar of engines. We'll answer that challenge. The behemoth fired. The shot tore through the sky, a streak of fire hurtling toward her climbing jet. Arya snapped the stick to the side, the warthog rolling hard. The round screamed past, bursting behind her in a plume that shoved the aircraft forward like a giant slap. Warnings flared red across her display, but she steadied her hands, forcing the machine back under control. On the ground, soldiers ducked instinctively as the massive shell detonated overhead. Some shouted her name, though the sound was swallowed by the chaos. They had seen her evade death so many times already that they clung to her, survival like a talisman, as if each maneuver proved there was still hope. Inside the command post, the colonel slammed a fist onto the table. "She can't keep dodging forever," he muttered. His staff stared, waiting for orders he didn't have. No doctrine accounted for one pilot dueling a fortress on treads. No strategy could explain what was unfolding on the plane. Arya banked wide, circling into the sun again. The light blazed across her canopy, hiding her from the gunners below. She could feel the machine's eyes on her, that relentless turret sweeping back and forth, hunting her shadow. She set her jaw, mind racing. Direct fire hadn't pierced its hide. She needed precision, something to exploit. Her gaze flicked across the battlefield. Wreckage scattered everywhere, fire-blackened hulks casting jagged shadows. And then her eyes caught the glint of something else, the faint shimmer of heat vents along the monster's back, barely visible through the smoke. They were shielded but not invincible. If she could line up a shot from the right angle, if she could strike when it was most exposed, her breath steadied into rhythm. She rolled the warthog into a dive, the nose tipped, the sun blazing at her back, her silhouette invisible in the glare. Below, the Colossus shifted its turret again, sensing the descent, preparing to fire. She didn't aim for the turret. Instead, she dove past it, her cannons snarling as she peppered the ground to its flank, forcing its crew to turn and adjust. Then she yanked upward, climbing hard, buying herself space. The monster followed, its barrel dragging upward, mechanical movement steady, inexorable. The trap was set. She looped wide, coming around behind the machine as it aimed toward where she had been. From this angle, she saw the faint vents again, red from strain, the exhaust of its immense power. Her finger tightened on the trigger. The Ju-8 erupted, thunder rolling from her belly. Shells streaked into the armored giant, hammering the vents, punching through the grates. Sparks cascaded like fireworks, smoke billowing from its back. For a heartbeat, she thought it might be enough. Flames licked upward, licking its hull like grasping hands, but the giant refused to fall. Its turret snapped around, impossibly fast for its size, and belched another round. The blast split the sky, narrowly missing her wingtip, the shockwave hurling her sideways. The cockpit shook violently, alarms shrieking. She gritted her teeth, fighting the spin, forcing the Warthog upright again. Her arms ached, muscles burning, but she pulled the aircraft level. Her chest heaved against the harness, sweat stinging her eyes. The monster still moved, wounded but not destroyed. Below, men stared upward, eyes wide at the duel they barely understood. The UAV operator clutched his controller, knuckles white, whispering for her to hold, to strike again. He swung his drone around, painting the giant with another laser mark, highlighting a seam near the rear tread. Arya caught it instantly, a faint diamond flashing across her HUD. She banked into another climb, circling wide, smoke trailing from her scarred wings. The world narrowed to the mark on her display, the diamond glowing against the dark beast below. She aligned herself, the horizon tilting, the sun behind her once more. Her engines roared as she drove into the dive, every nerve alive. The GAU-8 spat fire, rounds hammering into the marked seam. This time the effect was immediate. The tread buckled, sparks spraying as the massive machine lurched sideways. Its balance faltered, its weight dragging against the ruined track. The ground tore beneath it as it struggled to keep moving. Cheers erupted from the ridges. Men who had thought themselves doomed moments earlier now bellowed in triumph. The monster had stumbled, its invulnerability fractured. But Arya did not celebrate. She knew stumbling was not the same as falling. The giant still had its cannon, still had armor thick enough to defy her guns. And as it turned, she saw its turret lock onto her path again. She pulled up, climbing sharply, but the shot came too fast. The shell tore through the sky, exploding near her tail. The Warthog bucked, the cockpit rattling like a drum. Panels flickered, warnings screamed. She clenched her teeth, forcing the aircraft back under control. The frame groaned but held. Her mind raced. Ammunition was running low. She couldn't keep circling forever. It had to end soon, one way or another. She steadied her breathing, forcing the fear aside. "This is it," she whispered. The monster moved forward again, dragging its broken tread, smoke pouring from its vents. Its turret swung, hunting her, determined to end the duel. Arya banked wide, then swung into a final climb. The sun flared behind her, painting her silhouette in fire. She leveled at the peak, then nose down, engines screaming as she dove. Below, every soldier lifted their head, breath held, watching the lone warplane streak downward like a comet. The GAU-8 bellowed one last time, a continuous roar that shook the heavens. Shells hammered into the wounded beast, chewing into its weakened flank. The explosions ripped deeper, flames pouring from its side. The Colossus groaned, a sound of steel torn apart before its turret froze mid-turn. Then the fire reached its core. The monster erupted in a detonation that split the plane. A tower of flame punched skyward, hurling armor and debris in all directions. The ground quaked, the shockwave battering the ridges, rattling the helmets of the men who watched. Arya yanked the stick, pulling her warplane up through the blast. Fire licked at her wings, the canopy glowing orange, but she rose clear, trailing smoke against the sky. Her chest heaved, her eyes locked on the inferno below. The Colossus was gone. What remained was a crater and burning wreckage. Its advance ended in fire. On the ridges, soldiers roared, their voices rising above the thunder, disbelief turning into wild exultation. In the command post, the colonel lowered his binoculars, his expression stripped of arrogance. "She did it," he said, barely more than a breath. Arya steadied her aircraft, scarred but alive, her breathing ragged inside her helmet. She had met the impossible and broken it. Above the Kharkov plains, the Warthog circled once more, wings glinting. In the fading light, the lone predator who had turned back the tide. The monster's death echoed long after the fireball had faded. A rolling wave of heat swept across the ridges, and fragments of steel clattered against helmets and shattered stone. Soldiers stared at the crater where the fortress had stood, mouths open, eyes wide. The impossible had collapsed into rubble, and for a fleeting heartbeat, the Kharkov plains seemed liberated. But relief on battlefields is fragile. Smoke still boiled from the forest edge, and distant engines rumbled beneath the haze. The roar of the destroyed Titan had not ended the fight. It had only marked the beginning of a new phase. Commanders on both sides knew this. Arya Kovalenko banked her aircraft wide, watching from above as the last flames licked at the wreckage. Her knuckles were pale against the stick, her chest rising and falling with every ragged breath. The Warthog rattled, its frame scarred, panels shivering from damage taken in the duel. Yet it held. She tilted her head, scanning the horizon for what she knew must come next. The enemy would not surrender. They had poured too much into this assault, committed too many resources to pull back now. The Colossus was gone, but the column was not finished. Her instincts were proven within moments. The tree line erupted with movement. More vehicles crawled into the open, not as massive as the fortress she had destroyed, but numerous, faster, supported by trucks carrying additional weapons. Rockets streaked upward, carving white lines through the haze, not to kill but to blind, saturating the sky with smoke. Behind the cover, lighter armor poured forward, scattering to surround the defenders from multiple angles. Down in the trenches, weary infantry scrambled to reload, commanders barking. Hoarse orders to hold their fire until targets came within range. Radios crackled with overlapping voices, fear and determination colliding in every message. The earlier cheers now shifted into grim readiness. They had seen miracles already, but miracles were not shields. Inside the command bunker, the colonel pressed his headset tighter, demanding updates. "Do we still have her in the air?" The answer came quick, affirmative. "She's circling." His shoulders dropped a fraction, though his face remained tight. Everyone in the room knew that if Arya fell, the line would not last minutes. Above, she tightened her turn, eyes narrowing against the smoke columns rising into her path. Her HUD danced with new threats, mobile guns spreading out, light armor maneuvering aggressively. A coordinated counterattack meant to break through while the defenders were still reeling. Her lips pressed together. The battle wasn't over. The real test had just begun. She nosed downward, engines screaming, cutting through the drifting haze. Below her, enemy armor surged forward in three prongs, one aiming for the ridgeline, another pushing toward the central trenches, the last sweeping wide to encircle. It was a strategy of numbers, overwhelming by sheer force. Arya lined up on the flanking push first. The GAU-8 thundered, rounds slicing into the lead vehicles. Two erupted in fire, smoke trailing upward as Rex skidded to a halt. The others scattered, some veering into ditches, others firing wildly upward. She pulled back into the sky, weaving through tracers that clawed after her, her breathing steadied, her focus razor-sharp. She could not let the enemy regain rhythm. Every dive had to disrupt, every strike timed to fracture their advance. She rolled wide again, targeting the center prong now. Explosions blossomed across the field as her ordnance detonated, carving gaps into the spearhead. Infantry in the trenches roared, rallying behind the storm from above. They surged to their feet, firing into disoriented crews scrambling from burning wrecks. The battlefield that had been on the edge of collapse just hours earlier now pulsed with renewed ferocity. Still, the third prong pressed forward on the flank. Sleeker vehicles, less armored but faster, used the chaos to dart toward the rear lines. If they broke through, the entire defense could unravel. Arya swung again, teeth clenched, her body pressed hard into the seat by brutal G-forces. She came in low, almost brushing the treetops, and released a string of bombs across the sprinting formation. The ground heaved as the explosions tore through, flipping lighter vehicles into the air like toys. Fire rolled outward, and the survivors scattered, momentum broken. In the bunker, officers leaned close to the radio, their earlier doubt replaced by fierce, wordless conviction. Each strike she delivered did more than break machines. It stitched together the will of the men on the ground. Every roar of her cannon was a promise that the lines still held. Yet the enemy adapted. From the cover of smoke, hidden artillery rolled into position, lobbing shells in wide arcs. They slammed into the ridges, tearing craters into the defenses, forcing the infantry back into the dirt. The air shook with concussions, dust raining from the bunker ceiling. Arya gritted her teeth, banking toward the artillery lines. Her HUD flickered as the UAV operator below painted targets again, faint diamonds appearing across her display. She angled in, engines howling, and unleashed her wrath. Explosions blossomed across the distant lines, artillery collapsing into twisted wreckage. But as she pulled upward, warning tones screamed. Fresh missile crews had moved into the open, locking onto her. Smoke trails surged skyward, claws of fire streaking toward her. She rolled hard, flares bursting behind, the cockpit rattling under the shockwaves of near misses. Her body strained under the force, but she held, wrenching the Warthog through the storm. She leveled out, chest heaving, the horizon tilting as she steadied the machine. Her ammo count blinked low, fuel gauges dipping. She could feel the battle dragging both her and her warplane toward their limits. Yet the sight below, soldiers rallying, the armored tide slowing, the line still intact, drove her onward. On the ground, men raised their rifles skyward in salute even as they fought. Voices, carrying words she could not hear but could feel, gratitude, defiance, faith. The enemy, frustrated and bloodied, began to withdraw into the smoke, dragging their wounded machines with them. The prongs that had sought to break the ridges now staggered, fractured, their cohesion shattered by relentless strikes from above. Arya circled once more, scanning the battlefield. Fires still burned, smoke cloaked the plain, but the momentum had shifted. The steel wave had lost its edge. She allowed herself one long breath, her eyes closing briefly. Not victory, not yet, but survival, and survival was enough for now. Far below, the colonel removed his headset, his expression unreadable. "She held them," he said simply, his voice hoarse. Around him, the bunker buzzed with exhausted relief. Above the battlefield, Arya's Warthog cut a lonely silhouette against the crimson sky, scarred and battered, yet still airborne. She banked into the fading light, engines growling like a vow. The battle wasn't finished, but as long as she remained in the sky, so did hope. The crimson sky bled into dusk as silence draped the Kharkov plains. Fires still burned in scattered pockets, sending ash drifting upward like black snow. Soldiers in the trenches barely dared to move, listening for engines that might yet return. The Colossus had fallen, the prongs of armor beaten back, but every man felt it in his bones. The battle was not done. Arya Kovalenko circled in her battered warthog, eyes flicking across flickering instruments. The gauges told a grim story. Fuel low, ammunition nearly drained, systems strained to their limits. Sweat soaked her undersuit, her muscles screamed with every maneuver, but she refused to descend. Not until she was certain the enemy was finished. Her visor reflected the ruined battlefield. Twisted hulks smoked beneath her, the wreckage of a steel tide that hours earlier had seemed unstoppable. She should have felt triumph, but unease gnawed at her chest. The enemy's commitment to the offensive had been absolute. They wouldn't abandon it with so little gained. Something was waiting. She could feel it. The forest line to the east seemed too quiet. No sporadic fire, no retreating silhouettes, just an unnatural stillness. She narrowed her eyes, banking closer, keeping her profile low. The sun dipped lower, casting the tree line into shadow, and then she saw it. Movement. Not the lumbering crawl of tanks, but the deliberate stir of concealed machines rolling free from camouflage. Missile trucks, row after row, emerging from tarpaulins and branches, their launchers tilting upward in chilling unison. Behind them, armored carriers spilled troops onto the field, a hidden reserve biding its time until now. Engines growled as more vehicles pushed into the open, lighter but numerous. Their advance timed with precision. The trap revealed itself in full. The earlier attacks had been a hammer, but this was the knife meant to twist. In the trenches, soldiers lifted binoculars, curses ripping from their throats as they glimpsed the fresh wave. Exhausted, battered, their hearts sank. They had fought through hell only to see hell reborn. Some muttered prayers, others clenched their rifles tighter. The colonel in the bunker slammed a fist against the table, rage and despair colliding. They held them back just to spring this now, he growled. Above, Arya's pulse steadied into grim resolve. Her HUD flooded with threat markers, so many it blurred into a wall of red. Her ammunition could not possibly destroy them all, but she could not allow this force to roll unchecked. If they reached the ridges, the already fragile line would snap. She angled into a climb, smoke trailing from her wings. The warthog groaned, but it obeyed. Her jaw clenched, mind racing. She needed to buy time, to carve gaps, to keep the enemy staggered long enough for the defenders to regroup. The first wave of rockets screamed skyward, white contrails clawing through the dusk. She rolled hard, flares spilling behind her in burning streaks. Explosions lit the air, buffeting her canopy, but she punched through, teeth gritted. Her vision swam, but she forced it clear. The A-10 roared back into position, angling downward. Her cannon erupted, tearing through the lead trucks. Vehicles burst apart, flames consuming crews as ammunition cooked off. The barrage of rockets faltered, lines of smoke scattering in half-formed arcs. She pulled up, the warthog shuddering from strain, alarms shrieking. Her chest hammered against the harness, but her eyes stayed locked forward. On the ground, infantry seized the moment. Commanders shouted fresh orders, units shifting to plug gaps, mortars belching fire into the advancing troop carriers. The defenders knew they could not match the enemy's numbers, but as long as she circled above, they would not give in. The second wave surged. Lighter vehicles darted across the plain, weaving through wreckage, their speed their shield. Arya descended again, her bombs tumbling into their path. Explosions rolled across the earth, flipping machines into the air, scattering men in every direction. Yet still more came, countless silhouettes pushing through the smoke. Her fuel gauge blinked dangerously low. Ammunition indicators glowed amber. She could feel the walls closing in, options shrinking, sky darkening. Her lips pressed into a line. She had one chance left. The UAV operator, still crouched over his battered controls, painted targets frantically. Diamonds blinked across her display, guiding her strikes. His voice, though unheard by her, whispered with every mark, "Hold on. Just one more run. Don't stop now." Arya banked higher than before, engines straining as she clawed altitude. The horizon bent, the world shrinking beneath her. From this height, the entire battlefield unfolded, a chessboard of fire and steel. She saw the reserves pushing forward, the trenches bleeding men, the command post bracing for collapse, and she saw the one place where the enemy's formation converged, the choke point that fed the entire assault. Her breath steadied. This was where she would strike. She nosed downward, the dive steep, almost reckless. The wind screamed along her fuselage, the canopy trembling as speed built. The sun blazed behind her, rendering her silhouette invisible until the last second. Below, the enemy scrambled, rockets launching wildly, tracers clawing upward. Too late. She unleashed everything. The GAU-8 roared with feral thunder, streams of fire tearing into the heart of the column. Bombs dropped free, tumbling into the choke point, detonating in a chain that ripped the ground apart. Vehicles erupted in violent succession, shockwaves tearing through the packed ranks. Men and machines alike were flung skyward, silhouettes dissolving into the inferno. The plane convulsed under the onslaught. Flames surged higher than the trees, smoke boiling into the heavens. The choke point disintegrated, the entire reserve thrown into chaos. Those who survived panicked, veering off in disarray, their formation broken beyond repair. Arya yanked the stick, hauling the Warthog upward through the firestorm. The cockpit rattled, warning lights flaring across her panel. Her body screamed under the force, her breath tearing from her chest, but she held, dragging the machine back into the sky. Below, soldiers erupted in disbelief. Men who had been seconds from collapse now shouted until their throats bled, their voices carrying across the field. The colonel in the bunker dropped into his chair, a broken laugh shaking his chest. "She's torn the heart out of them," he said, voice rough. Arya leveled off, the sun painting her wings in molten gold. Her ammunition was nearly gone, her fuel dangerously low, but her will remained unbroken. She glanced down once more at the shattered reserves, the battlefield she had remade. The enemy had gambled everything on their hidden force, and in one furious strike she had turned their final blade into smoke and fire. But she knew the night was not over. Somewhere in that haze, survivors regrouped, commanders shouting desperate orders. And she, with only scraps of strength left, would have to decide whether to press again or trust that the defenders could hold. Her hand tightened on the throttle. The Warthog growled in answer, scarred but unbowed. As long as she drew breath, the sky belonged to her. The battlefield writhed beneath the last glow of daylight, a canvas of fire and smoke stretching in every direction. The hidden reserve had been gutted, their momentum torn apart by Arya's dive. Yet despite the devastation, the Kharkov plains refused to fall silent. Engines still grumbled through the haze, scattered but alive. Flares cracked in the distance as retreating units tried to reassemble into something resembling order. Arya Kovalenko sat strapped inside her cockpit, every muscle aching. The U-10 groaned around her, instruments blinking warnings like wounds refusing to close. Her ammo gauges hovered near empty, fuel burned lower with each pass. The Warthog was bleeding, but still it answered her commands, loyal to the end. She adjusted the throttle with careful pressure, steadying her climb, eyes scanning the ground for movement. What she saw made her stomach tighten. Survivors weren't fleeing outright. They were gathering, clumping around the remains of their heavier vehicles, forming pockets of resistance. Commanders were shouting them into lines, preparing one more strike. They weren't fighting for victory anymore. They were fighting for pride, for the illusion of strength in the face of disaster, and desperate forces could still be deadly. In the trenches, soldiers clutched rifles with trembling hands, some leaning against broken earthworks, too exhausted to stand. But when they lifted their gazes skyward and saw her silhouette still circling, their spines straightened again. Every roar of her engines reminded them that they were not abandoned, that someone still carried the battle in the heavens. The colonel in the bunker pressed a hand over his mouth, as if suppressing words he couldn't let slip. He had doubted her at every turn, mocked the very machine she flew. Now, with the battlefield lit by the wreckage she had sown, he understood the scale of his misjudgment. His voice finally rasped into the radio. "Kovalenko, whatever you can give, will hold." Arya didn't answer. She had no breath to waste. Her focus narrowed to the final knots of enemy strength below. She tipped her nose and dove again, but this time her guns were nearly dry. The cannon spat a last burst, scattering sparks across the plain before falling silent. She didn't curse. She expected this. Instead, she shifted to precision. Small bombs dropped into the densest cluster of armor, erupting in shockwaves that threw men sprawling. When her payload emptied, she pulled sharply into the sky, the cockpit rattling under strain. The enemy staggered but clung to the ground, still trying to advance inch by inch. Their stubbornness was almost admirable. Almost. The UAV operator wiped sweat from his brow, his fingers dancing over battered controls. His small drone buzzed unseen high above, guiding her where her eyes could not. His faint laser marks dotted new targets. Supply trucks hidden behind smoke, mobile guns edging forward. Arya's HUD lit up with those signals, her partnership with the unseen ally deepening. They had never spoken, but together they fought as if they had trained side by side for years. She angled in again, using the last of her rockets. Trails streaked behind her as the missiles tore into the supply trucks. Fireballs erupted, secondary explosions ripping through ammunition stocks. The shockwave rolled outward, knocking men flat, shredding the enemy's final reserves. From the ridges, defenders saw the blasts and surged with new fire in their eyes. Some clambered from trenches to counterattack, bayonets glinting as they stormed across scorched soil. Others unleashed mortars, shells plunging into what remained of the enemy formation. The balance of power had flipped, but Arya knew she had reached the limit. Her racks were empty, her cannons silent, her fuel dangerously low. She circled once more, watching, heart pounding. She could do no more from above. The fight now belonged to the men on the ground, and yet she stayed. The enemy, broken but not entirely routed, attempted one last push. A knot of armored carriers accelerated across the plain, carrying troops desperate for one final strike at the ridges. Their courage was feral, stripped of discipline, but still a threat. Arya pushed her throttle forward, though she had nothing left to fire. She dove low, screaming across the battlefield just above treetop height. The warthog's howl tore through the chaos like thunder. Soldiers below froze at the sight of her looming overhead, convinced she was about to strike. Panic seized them. Drivers swerved, crashing into one another. Troops bailed out of carriers, scattering into the dirt. The formation unraveled not from her weapons, but from the terror she carried in her shadow. On the ground, defenders pounced. Gunfire erupted, mortars cracked, and the last offensive disintegrated. Smoke and fire swallowed the attempt before it reached the ridges. Men in the trenches cheered, their voices breaking with exhaustion and relief. The colonel finally let out the breath he'd been holding. "It's over," he whispered, though he almost didn't believe it. "By God, it's over." Arya pulled back on her stick, climbing through the rising smoke. Her chest heaved, her body trembling. She had nothing left. No bombs, no rounds, barely enough fuel to return. But the plain below told her all she needed to know. The advance had been crushed. The steel tide had broken against her. As she leveled out, the sun slipped fully beyond the horizon. The last light caught the edges of her wings, turning the battered warplane into a silhouette of fire and shadow. Soldiers on the ridges pointed upward, some saluting, others simply staring. She was not just a pilot to them now. She was the figure who had turned despair into defiance, who had proven that even the strongest tide could be broken by courage. In the bunker, silence fell heavy. The colonel sank into his chair, shoulders bowed. When he finally spoke, it was not to his staff but to himself. "I called her obsolete," he murmured, "and she just saved us all." On the plain, enemy survivors fled into the tree line, abandoning wrecks that smoked like funeral pyres. The Kharkov Plains, once a place of doom, now belonged to those who had refused to break. Arya banked once more, the engines coughing as if in protest. She set her heading for base, her mind heavy with exhaustion. But in her chest there was a quiet fire, an understanding that she and her machine had written themselves into history this day. Down below, men would tell the story in their own words. Some would speak of the roar from above, others of the sight of steel splitting apart under impossible fire. Many would whisper her name, passing it along like a legend. And long after the smoke cleared, when the world looked back on the battle of Kharkov, they would remember the moment when even the greatest armored columns stalled. Not because of superior numbers, not because of overwhelming force, but because one pilot in an aging warplane refused to yield. Arya Kovalenko's Warthog, scarred and stubborn, had shredded the steel advance. The plane fell silent, carrying her legacy into the night. The Kharkov plains lie quiet now. The echoes of thunder have faded, and the sky that once shook beneath fire has grown still. Where columns of steel once carved the earth in arrogant confidence, only wreckage remains. Twisted tracks, shattered turrets, smoldering shells. Yet the silence carries more than the memory of destruction. It carries the weight of defiance, the soundless roar of men and women who refused to yield when every calculation said they must. Arya Kovalenko's name will not be found etched on medals in neat rows or recited in polished speeches. Her warplane was mocked as outdated, her place in the sky dismissed as a relic. But when the ground shook and hope bled thin, it was she who rose. Her Warthog climbed into the fire, scarred and stubborn, proving that courage matters more than sleek designs or hollow proclamations. In that cockpit, every decision was a gamble. Every dive was a choice to sacrifice herself for those below, and in each roar of her cannon the impossible bent. Think of the men in the trenches who had nearly abandoned hope. Faces pressed into the dirt, breath stolen by fear, eyes dulled by exhaustion. They looked up and saw a silhouette tearing through the smoke. In that shape they saw not just a machine, but a lifeline. They believed again because she refused to quit. They fought again because she reminded them they were not alone. The battlefield does not write poetry, yet this day etched lines that will outlast steel. A single pilot turned an avalanche into ashes. A single will carved cracks into an unbreakable wall. and a warplane written off as obsolete became the hand that held the line. Veteran Biker is not about victories tallied on maps or numbers scrawled in reports. It is about these moments, when ordinary flesh and bone defy inevitability, when one person carries the weight of many, when history tilts not because it was supposed to, but because someone refused to let it fall the other way. So when you hear the hum of engines overhead, remember this. Somewhere, someone is standing between chaos and collapse. Somewhere, someone is flying into fire so that others may see another dawn. And sometimes it is not the new or the celebrated who change the tide, but the overlooked, the doubted, the ones dismissed until the moment they prove indispensable. This was the day even the tank columns stalled in chaos, because one woman in an A-10 shredded the steel advance. To you, our viewers, thank you for riding through this story with us. Every voice matters, every comment carries weight, and your support keeps these stories alive. If this moment stirred something in you, show it. Like this video, share it with others who need to hear it, and subscribe to Veteran Biker so you don't miss the next tale of courage and defiance. When this video ends, more stories wait for you on the screen, journeys of resilience, sacrifice and honor. Click, watch and ride with us. Because together we are more than an audience. We are Veteran Biker.